Every February, something happens in California that doesn't happen anywhere else on Earth. More than half of every managed honeybee in the entire United States, trucked in from nearly every state in the country, converges on a single valley for exactly 3 weeks. They're not there for honey. They're there for one crop, the almond. California grows almost 80% of the entire world's almonds, nearly 3 billion pounds a year, from land that gets almost no natural rain during the growing season and from a tree that cannot make a single nut without outside help. No bees, no almonds, not fewer almonds. None. This is the story of how a single tree on a single stretch of desert dry land became so dependent on an insect that America now has to move half its entire bee population across the country just to keep the tree alive. Before any of the water, the bees, or the billion-dollar industry, there's a strange botanical fact most people never think about. The almond tree isn't really a nut tree at all. Genetically, it's a close cousin of the peach, the plum, and the cherry, all members of the same prunus family of stone fruits. What we call an almond is technically the seed inside a dry, fuzzy, inedible fruit, almost identical in structure to a peach pit. Crack open a peach pit, and you'll find something that looks remarkably like an almond nestled inside. Somewhere in the plant's evolutionary history, growing in the dry regions of the Middle East and Central Asia, wild almond trees dropped the soft, edible flesh entirely and put all their energy into the seed instead. Since water was too scarce to waste on a fruit nobody needed, that single evolutionary shortcut, trading a juicy fruit for a tough, storable seed, is part of why almonds tolerate dry California summers as well as they do. It's also why, structurally, almond orchards are managed more like stone fruit orchards, pruned into the same open shapes, sprayed against many of the same pests, than like a typical nut tree, such as a walnut or pecan. Most fruit and nut trees in America can at least partially pollinate themselves, or lean on wind and local insects to get the job done. The almond tree cannot. Almond flowers require pollen from a genetically different variety of almond tree, carried directly onto the blossom, and only an insect can carry it precisely enough and in large enough volume to matter. That single biological fact is the root of almost everything you're about to see. It's why almond orchards are never planted with just one variety. Every few rows switch between varieties like Nonpareil and Monterey specifically, so the trees can cross-pollinate each other. It's why the entire almond industry runs on a 3-week window every February, the exact narrow gap when nearly every tree blooms white across the whole Central Valley at once. And it's why, more than any other crop in the country, almonds turned into the single largest managed pollination event in the history of American agriculture. California's Central Valley, stretching from Sacramento down through Fresno, Kern, Stanislaus, and Merced counties, has almost the perfect climate for almonds on paper. Mild winters, hot, dry summers, deep, well-drained soil. One thing it doesn't have is water during the growing season. Almost no rain falls between April and October, the exact months an almond tree needs the most. So before a single tree goes in the ground, growers install a network of drip irrigation lines and, increasingly, buried soil moisture sensors that report back to a central dashboard in real time. Every drop the tree receives for the next 25 years will come from this system, not the sky. Planting itself takes patience most crops don't demand. A newly planted almond tree won't produce a commercial crop for 3 years and won't hit full production until year 5 or 6. Multiply that weight across more than 1.39 million bearing acres, a record high, and you start to understand why almonds are treated less like a seasonal crop and more like a long-term infrastructure investment, planted once and harvested for the next quarter century. Here's the number that stops most people cold. Pollinating California's almond orchards takes roughly 2 honeybee colonies for every single acre. With well over 1 million bearing acres, that adds up to somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million beehives, all needing to be in place by the second week of February. California doesn't have anywhere close to that many bees living in the state year-round. Only around 500,000 colonies are permanent residents. Every other hive has to be trucked in from Florida, from the Dakotas, from Texas, sometimes from more than 2,000 miles away. Semi-trucks stacked with pallets of hives drive almost entirely at night, when bees are less active and less likely to overheat or try to escape the hive. A single flatbed can carry over 400 hives. Multiply that across the entire fleet moving into California every January, and you get one of the strangest logistics operations in American farming. Tens of thousands of individual truckloads, timed almost to the day, all converging on one valley for a bloom that lasts about 3 weeks and then is gone. Beekeeping used to be primarily a honey business. Almond pollination flipped that upside down. For many of America's commercial beekeepers, the almond bloom is now the single largest paycheck of the entire year, sometimes bigger than every other pollination contract and honey sale combined. Growers pay by the hive, not by the acre of fruit produced, with rental rates that have climbed well past $200 per hive in strong years. Multiply that across 2 million plus hives, and pollination fees alone can total hundreds of millions of dollars, flowing from almond growers to beekeepers in a single 3-week window. But the arrangement is fragile in both directions. Beekeepers have reported significant annual colony losses from disease, pesticide exposure, and a hive-destroying parasite called the varroa mite, meaning the supply of available bees isn't guaranteed to keep pace with an industry that keeps planting more acreage every year. Some seasons have come uncomfortably close to a shortage, an outcome that would leave millions of blossoms unpollinated and an entire year's crop at risk before a single nut ever formed. Once the hives are placed between the rows, timing takes over completely. Almond blossoms only stay receptive to pollen for a matter of days, and the whole valley has to bloom, get pollinated, and set fruit inside one narrow window. Weather becomes the single biggest threat during this stretch. A cold snap can keep bees clustered inside their hives instead of flying. Heavy rain can wash pollen off the blossoms entirely or keep bees grounded for days at a time. Beekeepers and growers now watch hyperlocal weather forecasts obsessively during bloom, because a single bad week in February can determine whether an almond farmer has a profitable year or a disastrous one, months before a single almond has even started to grow. Once pollination succeeds, tiny green almonds begin to form, still encased inside a fuzzy green hull, and the orchard shifts from a pollination operation into a growing operation that will run for the next 6 months under the California sun. Here's a number that has made almonds one of the most argued about crops in America. Producing a single almond takes roughly a gallon of water. A single almond. Multiply that across a pound, then across nearly 3 billion pounds a year, and California's almond orchards draw several million acre-feet of water annually, a figure regularly compared to the water use of entire major cities. Almond trees can't simply skip a watering the way an annual row crop can fallow for a season. They're permanent, woody investments. Underwater them during a drought year, and you don't just lose 1 year's nut crop, you can damage the tree's long-term productivity for years afterward. That single fact has made almonds the center of California's water politics for over a decade, blamed by some critics as a driver of groundwater depletion in the Central Valley, and defended by growers as one of the most water-efficient permanent crops per dollar of value produced. In response, the industry has poured money into precision irrigation, deficit irrigation strategies that intentionally stress trees at specific growth stages without hurting yield, and soil moisture sensor networks that adjust watering block by block instead of flooding an entire orchard uniformly. Some growers have also turned to groundwater recharge projects, deliberately flooding sections of orchard during wet winters to let excess rainwater soak back down into depleted aquifers, effectively turning almond farmland into a giant, slow-motion water storage system during the rare years when California gets a surplus. Water use per pound of almonds has measurably improved over the last few decades. But in a state that lives drought to drought, that hasn't ended the argument, and it likely never fully will, as long as a permanent, water-hungry crop keeps expanding across a landscape that was never designed to support it without irrigation. Unlike a strawberry or a cherry, nobody picks an almond off the tree by hand. When harvest arrives in late summer, a mechanical tree shaker rolls down the row, clamps a padded arm around each trunk, and shakes the entire tree violently for just a few seconds, enough to send every ripe nut crashing to the ground at once. That's step one of a three-step harvest most people have never heard of: shake, sweep, and pick up. After shaking, the almonds sit on the orchard floor for several days to dry naturally in the sun. Then a mechanical sweeper rakes the fallen nuts, still inside their hulls, into long, continuous windrows running down the center of each row. Finally, a harvester machine drives over the windrow and vacuums the entire crop up off the ground, separating nuts from dirt, leaves, and debris as it goes. It's one of the few major American crops where the harvest touches bare orchard soil before it ever reaches a truck, which is exactly why dust control and dust-reducing equipment have become their own small industry within almond farming, protecting both worker health and nearby air quality during the busiest weeks of the season. What arrives at the processing plant isn't the almond you'd recognize. It's still wrapped inside a thick, leathery green-brown hull with a hard shell underneath that, and only then the almond kernel most people actually eat. At the Huller-Scheller facility, machines strip the hull away first, then crack the shell in a separate pass calibrated to break the shell without crushing the kernel inside. From there, almonds run through optical sorters using high-speed cameras and sometimes X-ray or near-infrared scanning, checking every single nut for insect damage, mold, and shell fragments, rejecting anything that doesn't pass in a fraction of a second. Almost nothing from this process gets thrown away. The hulls, roughly a third of the tree's total harvested weight, are collected and sold as livestock feed, since they're surprisingly high in digestible fiber and sugar. The shells get chipped into bedding for dairy cows and horses, or burned as biomass fuel to help power processing plants. A crop most people think of as just a snack or a splash of milk substitute actually generates almost as much usable byproduct by weight as it does edible nut. 20 years ago, almonds were mostly a snack-azel product. Today, a huge share of the crop goes somewhere almost nobody expected: almond milk and other plant-based products. Driven by a wave of consumers moving away from dairy, that shift changed the economics of the entire industry. Almond milk requires far fewer whole, cosmetically perfect kernels than the snack market does, since the nuts get blended and strained rather than sold whole in a bag. That's opened a market for lower-grade almonds that previously had less value, while simultaneously putting pressure on growers to keep expanding acreage to meet demand from beverage companies that didn't exist as major buyers a generation ago. But that popularity created its own backlash. Almond milk's water footprint per glass has become one of the most cited statistics in the entire plant-based food debate. A single fact stapled onto grocery store, think pieces, and documentaries again and again, turning what used to be a niche health food item into a genuine flashpoint in the middle of California's water politics. Water scarcity hasn't just changed how almonds are grown. In the driest recent years, it's changed how many almond trees exist at all. When water allocations tighten and almond prices soften at the same time, some growers make an economically brutal decision: pull mature, healthy orchards out of the ground entirely, sometimes tens of thousands of acres in a single year across the Central Valley, rather than keep paying to water trees that aren't profitable at current commodity prices. An almond orchard is a 25-year commitment made all at once at enormous upfront cost, years before the first nut is even harvested. That makes the entire industry unusually exposed to swings in water availability and global almond prices in a way that annual row crops, which farmers can simply choose not to plant in a bad year, are not. Every acre of pulled orchard represents years of investment and irrigation infrastructure, bulldozed and burned or chipped in what growers call a push, a stark reminder that even a permanent crop isn't permanent when the water runs out. Bees aren't the only insects with a starring role in almond farming, just the only welcome one. Navel orangeworm, a small moth whose larvae burrow directly into the developing nut, causes hundreds of millions of dollars in crop damage and rejected shipments across the industry every year, since even minor worm damage can get an entire load downgraded or refused at export. Growers fight back with an approach called mating disruption, releasing synthetic versions of the moth's own pheromones across the orchard in massive volume, so male moths become so overwhelmed and confused by the scent that they can't locate females to mate with at all. It's pest control by sabotaging insect romance rather than by spraying poison, and it's become one of the most widely adopted techniques in the entire industry, precisely because it reduces the need for broad insecticide sprays that could also harm the very bees. The orchard depends on every spring. Timing sanitation matters just as much. Growers are required to shake and remove leftover mummy nuts, still clinging to branches after harvest. Since those forgotten nuts become the exact overwintering shelter, the next generation of worms needs to survive the winter and reinfest the orchard come spring. Facing rising labor costs, water restrictions, and a shrinking farm workforce, almond growers have leaned harder into automation than almost any other tree crop in America. Autonomous, GPS-guided tree shakers and sweepers now handle harvest with far less manual driving than a decade ago. Aerial drones fly regular passes over orchard blocks, using multispectral imaging to spot water stress, disease, or nutrient deficiency in individual trees days or weeks before a human scout on the ground would notice anything wrong. Some of the newest almond varieties have also been bred specifically to be self-fertile, capable of setting a crop with less cross-pollination and, in some cases, requiring only a single beehive per acre instead of two. It's a direct response to the industry's biggest structural risk, an entire multi-billion-dollar crop that has, for its whole modern history, depended on an insect population it doesn't fully control. None of this technology has eliminated the need for bees, but it represents the first real attempt in the industry's history to design its way out of total dependence on a single, fragile, 3-week pollination event. Once processed, the overwhelming majority of California's almonds leave the state, and much of it leaves the country entirely. California supplies the vast majority of all almonds traded internationally, shipping to Europe, India, China, and the Middle East from ports up and down the state. India alone has become one of the single largest destinations for the crop, where almonds are eaten daily as a health food, soaked overnight, and consumed as part of traditional diets, driving demand that has grown steadily even during years when American domestic consumption has stayed flat. That dominance means almost the entire world's almond supply now runs through a single valley, subject to a single state's water politics, a single migratory bee population, and a single narrow bloom window every February. A bad frost, a bee shortage, or a severe drought year in California doesn't just affect American shoppers. It ripples through almond prices on grocery shelves on the other side of the planet, in bakeries in Europe using almond flour, in Indian households buying almonds by the kilogram, in chocolate factories that rely on a steady, affordable supply of California kernels for everything from candy bars to protein bars. Australia has emerged as the industry's only real global competitor, expanding almond acreage rapidly over the past 2 decades, using many of the same irrigation and mechanization techniques pioneered in California. But even with that growth, Australia's entire almond output remains a small fraction of California's, nowhere near enough to meaningfully diversify the world's dependence on a single valley, a single bee migration, and a single American drought cycle. It's an almost unbelievable amount of global dependency resting on one crop in one region, pollinated by one insect that has to be physically trucked in from across the country every single year just to keep the whole system running. The almond looks like one of the simplest foods on the shelf, a small, dry, shelf-stable nut that barely seems to need explaining. But behind it sits one of the largest managed insect migrations on Earth, a multi-million-acre irrigation system built to survive a summer with almost no rain, and an entire state's water politics wrapped around a tree that cannot reproduce without outside help. Next time you eat a handful of almonds or pour a glass of almond milk, remember that a truck full of rented bees, driven through the night from somewhere 1,000 miles away, is part of the reason that almond exists at all.